Welcome, everyone. I'm thrilled to be here today with our guest, Jamie Dokovna. And Jamie is an attorney with the firm Becker, based in West Palm Beach, Florida. She is here with us today because this episode of Caregiving Insights we're going to discuss the topic of employer/employee relationships and how it relates to caregivers. It's a meaty topic. There's a lot in here. So there are things that are often come up that are misunderstood or not understood at all. And we're going to look to Jamie to help us understand a lot of this. So welcome, Jamie.
Thanks, Todd. I'm happy to be here. I'm happy to help and hopefully shed some light on what otherwise could be a very confusing topic when you start dealing with caregiving and the intersection of that with legal issues and how that may affect people, especially people who are still working. And there's a lot of us that still work, myself included.
So to set this up for folks, I'm going to give them a little background so they understand where you're coming from. Not just that you're coming from originally Youngstown, Ohio.
All right.
So your undergrad was at the Ohio State University with a degree.
I'm glad that you got that. It's very important that you have the Ohio State. Yes, go Bucks.
It is, I understand. And so that degree was in criminology, but then you followed it up going to law school down here at the University of Miami. You've been a shareholder at Becker, and you've been at Becker for over 17 years.
Yes, I know, it's a long time.
The firm has expertise in a whole host of different areas, from construction law and litigation to government law and lobbying, international trade, tax asset protection, et cetera, et cetera. What we're going to focus on today is your area. So, business litigation and talking about the employer-employee component of it, because you have extensive experience in that area in various aspects, from employment law and litigation, which includes wrongful termination, harassment, discrimination, so on and so forth. And also, you're going to shed light on these acronyms that a lot of people hear in the news, and they hear it and they go, oh yeah, well, really, what is it? Such as the ADEA, FMLA, ADEA, FCRA, and FLSA.
Alphabet soup, right?
Exactly. And whatever kind of broth you want to put that in. So let's touch on some of that in what we're talking about today. And I know you counsel clients on a range of these issues. And so without further ado, I'm going to ask you the first question, which is, are there any legal protections for caregivers under the law? And I know that's a broad-based question, and we're going to get deeper as we go on.
Yes. The good news is, yes, there are protections in the law for caregivers. But really, the question is context. So what is the context? So, for example, when you talk about FMLA, which is the Family and Medical Leave Act, which offers protection for you if you have a serious medical injury or illness that you're dealing with, or if you have a loved one that you are caring for, parent, child, spouse, you have protection under the law. If, for example, you're an employee at a company that employs at least 50 other employees. If you work at a small employer, and there's sometimes confusion about that because people think, oh yeah, shouldn't I have leave if I need it? Well, if you live in a state that mandates it, maybe, but when you're in a state like Florida, for example, if you work for a small employer, let's say you work for an employer with 20 employees, well, you wouldn't have protection under the FMLA, the Family and Medical Leave Act, which would give you up to 3 months of unpaid leave, it's unpaid leave, but job protection. So you have the time to take care of your loved one if you need to, but it only gives you a small amount of time, but it does offer you job protection, and it does continue with your benefits during that time. But then you have other laws, like, for example, the ADA, which is Americans with Disabilities Act, which is a law that covers smaller employers. So you don't need 50, you only need 15. And there is also protection to you if you are caring for a loved one. Let's say, you have parents that you're taking care of and you're interviewing for a job and somehow it comes up and the employer says, well, God, I don't know if I want to hire this person because, well, I mean, it seems like this is going to be a problem. They're going to be taking off work. They're going to need to take their parents to the doctors. I don't know. Maybe I'll pass. Well, the law says you can't do that. There's protection based on your association with somebody who may have a disability. So, there's protections in the law there. I think you may have ADEA is age discrimination in employment, which is covers employers with 20 or more employees. And that obviously says that you can't discriminate based on age. So not necessarily caregiving, protections, but definitely protection to those who are older and, may face discrimination because of their age. And then there, are some other issues and some other laws that could come into play. But, really the main thing are those types of laws that you're seeing that cover, based on disability, association based on disability, or the Family Medical Leave Act, which gives you time if you need to take care of somebody who is sick.
Well, that's great. That took care of 3 out of the 5 acronyms. So, which is going to be.
Wait, there's more.
There is, and they may or may not apply, but we'll look to you for that. So the FCRA, Florida Civil Rights Act, does that have any bearing at all?
So Florida Civil Rights Act is very similar to the federal laws. It's just the state level. Interestingly enough, in a lot of counties in Florida, South Florida particularly, they also have their own local laws that mimic the state. So you have what's really like a tri-level system. So you have the federal system, you have the state system, and then the local level. And all of these kind of act very similarly. So the Florida Civil Rights Act says, same thing, you can't discriminate, and it includes disability in there. So it doesn't have its own specific, but it also has other protections. So based on, sex, for example, based on religion. So it protects all of the same things that you're seeing in other laws. It just does it in one and under the guise of the state. And then it has 15 or more employees before you become a covered employer under the law. And then, like I said, you have sometimes you have local laws that also, like Palm Beach has its own, Broward has its own, Miami-Dade has its own. So sometimes it can get very specific. So you can have it on the macro level, but you can also have it on the micro level too. And then whether or not you work for a covered employer really depends on the law. So you have to see how the law defines what is an employer under those laws to figure out whether or not those laws would apply in the context of the employee-employer relationship.
And how about the final acronym, which is FLSA?
So FLSA is the Fair Labor Standards Act, which is just, it's a law that concerns how you pay your employees. So it is a law that provides protection for you if you work overtime. It requires payment of minimum wage and also requires employers that are covered to keep good records about that. So it makes sure you get paid. So it's an important law.
Yes.
And that you get paid correctly.
So of these 5, which would you say, or are there any of them that come into play primarily related to caregiver issues relative to PTO, paid time off?
Yes, so they can, and they can come up in all different sorts of ways. So a lot of times these things sort of work together in, really like a symbiotic way. And if you have, good HR, good employers sort of understand the nuances of how these laws work together and sometimes overlap. You sometimes see under the law, like for example, with the ADA says, and there's some case law out there, even though the ADA is a working statute and the expectation is that you will work under the ADA. It's not I can't work, like FMLA, I can't work. But you see some interplay where some courts have said, for example, it may be reasonable, especially if it's not an undue burden on you as an employer, to provide some type of leave to the employee. So even though, and we'll talk about this later, and I know this is like a really big topic about PTO, but PTO is one of those things that under a lot of states, I mean, you're not required to any type of paid leave. And certainly when it comes to something like vacation, which we all like and want and need, it's not mandated under the law.
Interesting.
So you have, where you may need to take time off, for example, to take care of somebody. But if you don't have time available or you don't work for a large enough employer, you have to think about, well, okay, what are my options in this particular kind of situation? And then, obviously the FLSA can come up because it deals with, how you're being paid. I mean, you're only paid for compensable time. It may impact you differently whether you are what most people, we lawyers, we say exempt and non-exempt, but not everybody understands those terms. I think more people understand hourly and salary. So it impacts salary workers in a different way than hourly workers, because hourly workers, if you don't work, you don't get paid, versus salary, if you go to work and even if you come in late, 2 days a week, you're still going to get paid for your entire salary. It's not like you're going to get docked that time. So, the FMLA, obviously, like I said, you can see some intersection of this, with PTO. You can even see some intersection of that with FMLA, because depending on the employer, and a lot of them do it this way, they run whatever PTO you have concurrently with your FMLA leave. So, for example, if you have, let's say 15 PTO days, your first 15 days of FMLA leave will be paid, which is a good thing. It's good to be paid. But you don't get the option of 15 plus this additional 3 months that you may have, through FMLA leave.
Good. So you kind of answered my next question. That next question is, are there baseline responsibilities for employers when it comes to providing PTO?
So, this is one of those things which is really interesting. And I say that because we've seen such a shift in the workplace and what employers need to do to get employees, and forget about good employees. I mean, just employees. I mean, I have so many clients that have had issues with hiring, and in a tight labor market, how you differentiate yourself can make all the difference. And so while you're not required, for example, to give vacation, I mean, I got to tell you, and if I had a client who said to me, do I have to give vacation to my employees? I would say, no, you don't have to. But if you want my advice, I would recommend that you do it, because I don't know who you're going to hire who's going to come work for you if you don't. I mean, so on one hand, you have a workforce which is, doing a lot more dictating about the terms of what they're willing to do when they come back to the work world or to remain in the work world, where in the past it was really, what does the employer want to offer? So while there's no mandates, some states do require that you provide sick leave. So there are some states that require, Florida does not. But another interesting shift that took place, listen, I feel like after COVID, all this time, it feels like a weird warp, so you've lost sense of track and time. But years ago, there was a shift from this idea where you compartmentalize your time off, where you have vacation, sick, and then you have personal time off. And personal was given, maybe one day, 2 days. Then you have maybe 3 sick days. And then you'd have more vacation time. And then there became this shift of, oh, well, wait a minute, maybe we'll just have PTO, like lump it all together. And, I think for the most part, employees like it, because employees that may not have, other obligations like taking care of a loved one may say, well, this is great, and I'm relatively healthy, so I get more time off than I otherwise would have had, or they don't feel compelled to use sick days when they weren't really sick. So you saw this big shift of going toward PTO where the employer said, listen, I don't care how you use your time off. To me, time off is time off. And if I'm prepared to give you up to X amount of days off, then I don't care how you use it. I don't need to worry about you going to the beach, when you're supposed to be sick.
So I have a multi-part question. It's a good segue to this. So let's think about PTO overall. And so a few parts. One, are employers large or small? Is there a distinction for how many days they are giving? What considerations go into determining the PTO policy? And is caregiving something that typically goes into their thinking with that, or really not much?
So, interesting. Caregiving is one of those things that I feel like, you're very on trend. So it is a topic that does come up. I think for smaller employers, for example, it's not really one of those benefits that they feel they can offer just because they're a lot smaller. And from the employer mindset, it's really, well, can we do this? Can we give this to employees, even though employees may really like it, and some may be very appreciative to have it? Can we as a company afford to do that? And so usually when it's a smaller employer, the answer is generally no. When it's a larger employer and they are really trying to pull from a diversified workforce and really bring in the best talent, those kinds of benefits can be very attractive for employees, and especially, in a world where we can work remotely, and they may not care which hours you get the work done as long as the work gets done. All those sorts of things come into play. And then, I think the big thing for employers is, how much time can we afford to give off to our employees before it starts really impacting our bottom line? And so there's no real science, if you will. It's not like you go to a textbook and you say, let me plug in these numbers and come up with the perfect amount of time off. But I think the general concept is usually, and especially if they still do it compartmentalized, is it's very much based on a hierarchy. When you come in, you have X. Over time, we will give you more, to reward loyalty, and, for employees that have been there longer, you have something to look forward to, because next year, or maybe in 2 years or 3 years or 5 years, you'll have more time off. When you shift to PTO is just, it's, like I said, it's still trying to figure out, what's that sweet spot of time off that they're going to give. And then it depends really on the employer. I mean, how much do they, feel that they need to do this to retain the kind of talent that they're looking for? And then also, what business they're in. So if they don't really care about that, you may not see as generous of a policy. Now listen, I have plenty of clients that still like no PTO your first year, and it's like, well, it almost feels like a prison sentence. That is going to be a very, very long year.
Yeah.
And then others where, you start day one, and although it would be very unusual day one for you to take vacation unless, in the hiring process, you told them you had a pre-planned vacation, but, really the expectation is that, your first few months there, you're not really taking time off, even though you may have it. So you may get, for example, 10 days of PTO. You may find that it's a little more difficult to use if you're not really taking that time during the first, 3 or 6 months of your employment.
So it sounds like that PTO is an evolving topic, and which makes sense, and that employers are handling it in different ways. But it also sounds like caregiving is somewhat addressed in their mindset when they're thinking about it. And it's not like it was years ago where they would carve out, okay, you have 5 days of caregiving time. It's
Right.
just sort of lumped into this PTO area. So
Right.
do employees, how much do you see and I can phrase it the other way, how much are employers willing to negotiate on PTO? And if so, if an employee, and I know it's going to vary, everything is relative. So if you have an employee that they really want, the employee can probably negotiate something in, rather than one they're like, okay, we've got 100 candidates that can do this job. They're not going.
Right. No, I think you hit the nail on the head, because it's what you negotiate on the way in, right? There's very much this idea that it's like you go in, you interview for a job, and there are plenty of people who it's like, okay, we want to hire you. And then they tell them what they're going to get. Like, and here, if you are hired by us, this is what you get. Versus other people who go into this and they're like, this is going to be a negotiation. This is what you want to give me, but this is what I'm willing to come here for, so you need to give me this. And so you very much, obviously, I mean, my attitude is always, what's the worst that you can be told no? I mean, what's the difference? If you're told no, you probably weren't going to get it anyway, but if you ask and you receive, aren't you glad you asked? So, for example, I mean, if you go in and you may ask about that, and I know it feels like, it may feel like a taboo topic in an interview. How much time off do you give? I think when you get to the point where you get an offer, and it's probably something that's more appropriate at that time, when they say, here's what we do. So for example, we give 2 weeks of paid time off. And you say, well, it's not as generous as what I would like. My old employer gave me 2 weeks, and, it just really never felt like enough. At the time they make the offer, you can say, this is great, I'm willing to come aboard, but I'd like 3 weeks. And oh, by the way, I don't want the restriction that I can't use it for 6 months. How about 3 months instead? So you can negotiate those things. I mean, and sometimes the employer may say, okay, fine, and great, and then you get what you want. Or may say, well, listen, I'm not going to give you more than 2 weeks, but I will agree that, instead of the 6-month restriction, we'll do the 3. So you can start using your paid time off sooner. And then listen, I mean, there's all sorts of other, times where, even though it may not necessarily be PTO, I mean, employers are still made up of people, right? We haven't got away from being human to each other, and every business is different, but it's not unusual for me to have clients that have told me, for example, I have a client, they have lots of employees, and they had an issue with a particular employee on his way out, but during the time he was there, they were very generous with him. His father wasn't doing well, and he wanted to go out, in the middle of the day to go to the hospital. And so he took his lunchtime to go out and visit his father. And at the end of the day, I mean, it was fine. The employer said, listen, even if it may impact the workday that a little bit, that's fine. We don't care. And, when his mother passed away, it was the same thing. There are a lot of employers that are understanding about, somebody's particular circumstance, because nobody, wants, your family members to be ill or to need, care and treatment, and sometimes you just have to do that. And by the way, imagine this, there's a lot of goodwill that comes with that. A lot of times employees, feel compelled, to want to stay, like, I'm treated well. They understood when I was going through a difficult time, the fact that they were understanding. And even though this didn't fit nice and neat into a particular policy, they were still understanding of my situation and willing to accommodate me to make it a little bit easier for me, because, most people know, and especially if they've experienced it, that it's difficult. It's a lot, it's one more responsibility and thing that you have to take care of that you didn't have before, your loved one's time of need.
Absolutely. And there's a fine line. So I've been on both ends of that. If we want to call it ends, they are ends. I mean, in a way,
Right.
employer-employee relationship. And I've been on both sides of that equation. And I've mentored and advised employees and through business over years, and especially young folks who are at their first or second job, having gone through this, and then even older folks. So, as an employer, it can be a challenge, because you have a fine line. A business has to run, and they're in business to generate revenue, and to make sure that, if they're public, they're shareholders, they have to answer to them, quote unquote. If they're private, well, they have there are reasons they have to succeed as well. So it's, where is that line? One of the things I always would tell people I talk to about negotiating, and that's a big topic that I've done many webinars on and talks, is I always come at everything from a holistic perspective. Let's not just look at your paid time off. Let's look at the culture overall, what you're going to be doing, the people you're going to be working with, what this looks like for your career overall moving forward. There's so many things to look at, because I think if people and employers, if they're looking myopically at one particular aspect of it, I believe they're losing perspective overall of what this relationship could and should be about.
No, I agree with you. I mean, I think that the ones who don't focus in on that, it's like you may head scratch, when you have a difficult time retaining the people that are there. At the end of the day, I mean, I don't think many employers feel that they need to be treated better than they feel that they should, right? Nobody says, well, listen, I should be overpaid. I should have more time off than I even need. I mean, most people don't feel like that, but they definitely have a sense of fairness, right? And a lot of the lawsuits that I deal with, the origin of it is this inherent idea of what is fair or unfair. And so while legally, there may not be a claim on the other side, because what the employer did was fine, but the employee may feel like, well, listen, I don't feel that I was treated fairly. And so sometimes you have these claims or issues or lawsuits that arise because at the origin, at the heart of it, is this fairness. So if you look at this, not necessarily myopically, but, look at it, in a more holistic way, it's like, how does this really, impact us as an organization? How do we want to be known? I mean, and listen, I mean, in today's day and age where things, hit like social media like that, I mean, some employers are very sensitive to it, but then you have, a company like Twitter, and when Elon takes over, and he's like, listen, people, this is going to be all hands on deck. You're going to be sleeping here. There's, and, you read these headlines, and, it almost becomes like really like laughable. Like, it's like a train wreck that nobody can, stop looking at, because it's just so unbelievable, the kinds of things that you're seeing. And for other employers, especially in the tech industry, if you were to go in there and say, listen, I'm currently working at Twitter, but I'm looking for other options, nobody's going to scratch their head and wonder why you're leaving. I mean, it's just like there's been this huge seismic shift to how they're doing business and how they are treating their employees. And that's the kind of stuff that you usually don't get to see. It's like the curtains have been opened, right? And you're seeing this play out, on national television, and on social media platforms. And, is that really good for business? I don't know. I mean, I got to think that if you are looking for a job, I don't know that you necessarily go there unless, you're somebody who's like, those kinds of things don't faze me.
Yeah, or I want that on my resume. A lot of it, I think, for employees comes back to transparency in the negotiation process, in that early process. And I think when we talk about fair, unfair, I'm sure you see this. This is the challenge, where if an employer's not transparent with something, and how transparent are you? Is it in writing, or is it just verbally? I mean, there's so many nuances to it that I'm sure you see.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, and that's one of the things, I think it's like the mystique of the employer. And I definitely do a lot more work on the employer end than the employee end. But it's the mystique of all of it. And if you, by the way, aren't transparent, what does that mean? And for a lot of employers, they don't want to be transparent, because when you're so transparent, then there's almost this sense of, you've lost control of the house. It's like now the children are in charge as opposed to the parents. There's very much, and I think from their perspective, a fine line of, what you can or should be transparent about versus what you feel that you need to sort of keep close to the vest, really for the benefit of the organization, because the employer mindset, really is just, I have to worry about the organization. And sometimes where it may feel like, for example, you're not being kind or caring to somebody that's going through a very difficult situation, the difficult part in that is sometimes you can't, because, the one thing that I, deal with a lot is, and I always say to the client, this becomes the yardstick now by which you're going to be measured. And so you really need to think about, if you do this, how is this going to impact you as you move forward? If you say, listen, I'm okay with how this is going to impact me, and if it may have some unintended negative consequences, I can live with it, fine. But, there's also a lot of people who are very risk adverse. And if you're risk adverse, my advice is always, listen, well, then you can't deviate from whatever your policies are. And so while it may feel bad to say, I'm not going to do this, which would otherwise be a nice or decent thing to do, at least the employee they may not like it, but there's at least a little more understanding, because there's that idea, kind of going back to that notion of fairness. They feel like they don't like it, but they feel like they're being treated fairly because everyone else who may be in the same or similar situation would be treated the same. So,
Yeah, absolutely. Transparency is, again, as you said, a fine line. There's a certain amount of transparency, and often it should be in writing. These are A, B, C, D, E.
right.
There are
Right.
those hard, let's call them the hard aspects of a contract, of an agreement, that are in there. The other things, as you said, the employer has to decide, how do I deal with this? Because if they do one, it's setting a precedent. And when you
Right.
set the precedent, that then creates a whole host of other potential issues down the line.
Absolutely. Well, think about it. when you go into most jobs, what do you expect that you're going to see? A handbook, right? And the handbook, it's not a contract, but it's a guide. It's like, I come here, it's like the instruction manual. How does this thing work, right? You go in and you look at it and you have all of these policies in place. And by the way, it's nice when a fact situation fits a particular policy, but we all know that there's plenty of times where it's like, I have a policy that says this, or I've read the policy and the policy says this. This is what I think it means. Because sometimes policies are ambiguous, or like I said, you have a factual scenario that doesn't fit so nice and neat into a box. And then what do you do with it? And then, then you have those considerations where, well, what kind of possible consequences are going to happen if we do it this way? If we do it this way? And then you create new policy on account of it.
So on to they're all contiguous. These topics all running together. But one of the things that we had outlined talking about before, are there instances where employers run afoul of legal responsibilities? I'm sure they do. When it comes to, though, providing PTO for caregivers, meaning, how would that play out? Is it specific to caregivers, and in what ways do employers have to be more cognizant of employee rights?
Yeah, so one, it depends where you are, right? Because there are states that do offer protection for caregivers. There's only a few of them. I think it's California, New York, New Jersey. I think there's like 5 of them. If you don't live in a state that mandates it, you're stuck with the things that we talked about initially. And so while an employer can say, for example, well, I just took PTO and I need to take some more PTO because, my dad fell and now I need to help him out and take care of him. I need some more PTO and I need to take it now. And your employer may say to you, I just approved your PTO and I can't give it to you right now because, it impacts everyone else. And listen, if it happens to happen during the holiday season where people are calling out, you may have an employer who says to you, listen, I can't approve it. And it's not because I don't want to, and it's not because you don't have it, and then, a lot of times you put an employee in a very difficult situation where they have to make really hard choices. Well, do I just not come to work, to deal with this? Do I reach out to somebody else who may be able to help? It's a lot, and there's not always, a right answer to any of this stuff. I think that's what makes it so difficult. Some things are black and white, but a lot of, especially in what I do, isn't so much. A lot of times, and it's like I think clients hate it's like the cliche lawyer answer. Yeah, maybe. Like, what does that even mean? Do you mean maybe yes, maybe no? I mean, maybe. Depends, right?
It's true. It's true. And so much is situational. It's timing. There's so many factors that go into it, the considerations that have to be taken. So when you have, it's any relationship. I mean, it's a relationship, and
It is.
there are considerations on both sides, and often both very valid. And so then you're at a point where, okay, what does an employer do? Where do they go? As we've been talking about, they have all these considerations. They have a whole company to consider. And what does this mean to them moving forward in the eyes of their managers and eyes of the employees? And then you have employees on the other side that could be in a difficult position where, okay, I'm not getting this. What do? I need the salary, but I need to care for my loved one. It's an incredibly challenging situation.
No, absolutely. I mean, and the reality is, I mean, look, I mean, I think you got to have your head in the sand if you don't really understand where we are in the world. I mean, the baby boomers are a huge generation, right? And we haven't seen, I mean, listen, baby boomers, like the generation was named after them. It's like boom, right? There's so many of them. And what does that mean? And so, you listen, sometimes culturally, there are a lot of cultures that the expectation is that you will care for your loved ones. And it's, out of sense of family and obligation. And this is just what we do. And then, you have other people that, it's like they have a strong sense of family, but it's not necessarily culturally. But it's a situation that, listen, everybody hopes that your parents will age and they will be fine and they will have no health issues and they will be like the people on the commercials and they're living their best life ever, right? But that's not always reality. And when you find yourself in a situation where it's not like it is on TV, it's like now we have to decide, well, how do we deal with that? And I think a lot of these issues, they're not necessarily systemic, but they're certainly issues that aren't going away anytime soon. I think that you're going to continue to see a lot of it. I mean, I even have, one of my partners, she's taking care of her parents. And, that wasn't something that she had to do before, and it's funny because she never had children. And it was interesting to see the perspective for her because, she was never a parent. So she never understood the constraints that were put on parents who work like myself versus, her who only had parents who were completely independent and healthy and good until they weren't, and then it's her. She's taking care of them. She's the one that's expected to take care of them. And so she went from, I just need to worry about myself to now I need to worry about myself and my parent. And what does that look like? And to have parents who need to go to the doctors in the middle of the day and she needs to be there and take them, but yet still has all of the responsibilities because your clients, it's not like, we have a do not disturb sign that, don't bother us, right? We're busy. And some people are, are more fortunate in their careers. I mean, I think we as lawyers, I mean, we're lucky in the sense that, on the one hand, it's like your day is just sort of like this constant wheel. It's like, your clients can need you at any given time, but the flip side of it, which is nice, is, we do have this whole day to get everything done. And so when the traditional workday may end for a lot of people, it doesn't end for us, but, you can go and take your parent to the doctors because it just means not that the work went away, but you'll just deal with it at a different time. But on a more general scale, I mean, I think those are the kinds of things that employers have to think about, like as we have an aging generation. What does that look like? How do we deal with people who may need to take care of their parents? Oh, by the way, what about those who need to take care of their parents and their children? Because there are plenty of people who have it, on both ends, right? It's not necessarily one to the exclusion of the other. But I think, and it's one of those things I said, I think like, we've become more adaptable, but just to me, this word has really just been something that's like on the forefront, especially since the pandemic, is that, notion of flexibility. You have to be flexible in what you do and how you do it. And, from the employer side, that flexibility does, make a difference, and then I think, on the employee side of it, it's, how can you make this work? I mean, I think that there's some employees that just don't get it, right? Like how you said, it's like, I see it from both sides. So, there's almost an advantage to that. But I think the difficult thing is when you don't see it from the other side, and it's just, you think very much of yourself and your situation and what you're going through, but, your employer doesn't have to just think about you. It has to think about everybody else who is employed by the organization, because sometimes those sorts of things, and I see it really all the time with clients. I mean, especially things is like, the FLSA does come up, but particularly because of the other workers that end up filling the hours for the employee who's not at work. And at least I have seen, there is very much this idea right now that, and I don't know many employers that are overstaffed, right? I mean, most are looking for staff, not, saying, well, my God, I need to really right size this organization, unless the reality is they probably should have right sized a long time ago, that they're bigger than what they need to be.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and to your point about when employees are looking for opportunities, you hear out there, I hear it all the time, just not necessarily relative to in an employment conversation, but with friends and people, when you're talking, and everybody's about, well, you got to look out for yourself. And so there's such that mindset, which I understand, I get it, because they're like,
you don't look out for you, who will, right?
Right. Everything's pretty much at will. I mean, they're at will agreement. So you've got to look out for yourself in this negotiation. And so when we sit here and I can look at it from both ends, it's hard for somebody to say, okay, well, I can see where they're coming from. Well, in the end of the day, are they going to be looking out for me? So it's a challenge. But to your point earlier about COVID, I think that, and we talked offline about that as well. I think one of the good things to come out of it, and there's been a lot of things obviously that have not been good and been challenging, but one of the good things to come out of it is flexibility. It's forced employers to take a look at this and be more flexible and realize, productivity isn't suffering. And I know that's going to change it, and it'll be dependent upon industry and what's needed and so on. But it takes the commute time out. They don't have to commute. They can be more focused. They can get things done. There's less stress on them because they don't have to worry. So there's so many things that, and this is going to be evolving, as we know, over time. But I think that is one of the good things. And like you and I are sitting here talking, people can do things through this. And I know there's fatigue and Zoom fatigue and so forth, but everything's always evolving. So it's, how do you evolve, and how does that morph, and how does it integrate into an overall policy?
This reality that we're kind of out of the experiment phase, right? Like, we know it works, there's no smoke and mirrors here. We know that we can go remote and employees will still be very productive as a whole, right? There's always going to be some outliers where you have issues where you're like head scratch and you're like, yeah, this employee seems like they're never logging on or off or whatever, which is a whole nother topic about,
Right.
looking in and seeing what the employees are doing during the workday. But, it very much will evolve over time. I think that a lot of these things are here to stay. I think this idea that you have to be more expansive in how you traditionally thought about the workplace, that idea and that notion is here to stay. I think it's a good challenge for employers to have to think about those sorts of things and what it looks like for them. I think it's a positive thing for employees because it's not like you're asking for something that seems so crazy, right? So to go in now and to negotiate, well, listen, if the employer's like, yeah, we have some people who work remote, but for the most part, everybody comes in 5 days a week. Well, guess what? You maybe can negotiate to work from home several days during the week, which allows you to do the things that you need to do if you're caring for loved ones, so you schedule doctor's appointments, on days where, you're going to be working from home as opposed to days where you're working from the office. And your day may look a little different than it otherwise would, but I think that people have, adapted, and that mind shift where, I think a lot of us have when we're in the office, we're working, and then when we leave, we're shut off. But when we've gone remote and when you work hybrid, that switch feels a little off, maybe even broken, right? I mean, you have a harder time differentiating between stop and go from your workday just because you're home, and that very much benefits the employer, not necessarily the employee. So, but it's give and take.
Absolutely. And the word I use, some maybe overuse, is everything's always evolving. So
It's evolving. True.
it is. What steps, and this is to help caregivers, people who are straddling that, I'm a caregiver, I'm working full time, just to help them understand, what does an employer need to go through in a termination process? Are there certain steps that employees need to be aware of?
Yeah, I mean, so I think all 50 states are at will. I mean, some may work a little differently, but generally speaking, it's a relationship that exists because both people want to be in it. But it also means if one doesn't want to be in it anymore, they can leave at any time and for really any lawful reason or even no reason at all. I have not seen, although I'm sure it could exist out there. I mean, I've been doing this a long time, but I've never had a client say to me, I want to fire this person. And I say, why? And they say, just because. I don't really have a reason. So I haven't seen the no reason, although I fully am aware and acknowledge that you can have no reason. Most employers do have reasons when they end. By the way, most employees have reasons when they want to end the relationship as well, so it definitely works both ways. For employers, there's no real magic way. All you need to say is this is not working. And, if there are problems with the relationship, I definitely think it is best that those problems should be discussed. So typically what you see are, progressive disciplinary policies. So if you're not adhering to them, like, for example, you're caring for loved ones, but, you're not clocking out when you go and check in on your parent. You are, checking in, clocking in, and you're not really doing work because you're doing something else. I don't necessarily think that you fire a person just because they do those things one time, although I fully acknowledge you can as an employer. Listen, you violate the policy one time, or by the way, even if I think you violated the policy, but you actually didn't, an employer can be mistaken, but it's just what they believe. If they believe that you violated the policy, that can be enough. Typically, it's best practice, to give a verbal warning. And then, usually you see it followed up by a written warning. Termination usually doesn't happen until there's multiple violations, unless you've done something really bad that warrants the end of the relationship. I mean, for the employee, listen, I think it is best practice, even though it's not required by law to give notice. I know that most of my clients, even though they may not take it, they may say to you, thank you for giving 2 weeks, but we don't need it. But I think a lot of employers appreciate that you give it. And, I always feel it's best not to burn bridges, even if you have no intention to walk back over to the other side. to leave on good terms. And so if you're the employee and you feel, well, maybe this isn't working for me anymore, and I need to be at a place that's more flexible, because this one really is pretty rigid, and I feel like they don't understand all the pressures that are put on me, and they really just don't get it. I need to work somewhere else where they're a little more understanding of those issues, and I'll be a really good employee on account of it, but I just can't be here, to give notice on the way out the door, and understand that they may take you up on that transition period and expect you to stay and help them, facilitate whatever transfer that needs to be done from one employee to the other. Those are just best practices, though. I can tell you it doesn't always happen that way. I mean, some are a little more explosive and a lot more interesting, than we have time for, but I'm sure you've heard, but I definitely have very interesting stories about that.
Communication. It really, a lot of it comes down to the two aspects you were just talking, and I'll kind of wrap things up in that way. You were talking about if something happens and an employer can say, that's it, you did it, even if they suspect. So like any relationship, I've done training over the years, sales training and so forth. You're building a relationship. So you, as an employee, you're building a relationship with the employer and vice versa. Communicating and trust. It all comes down to trust, doesn't everything? And
oh, absolutely. Absolutely. No, communication is key. Trust, by the way, I always say to clients, because, what they feel and what they're internalizing isn't always what they articulated as being, right? So I have clients all the time who talk about these issues or problems that they're having. And at the end of the day, I mean, it always comes up where I say, well, isn't it that you just do not trust the person anymore? And it's like a light bulb goes off, imagine that, and it sounds so simple. And a lot of times it is, but one of the things that I found that's very interesting about the work relationship is in your personal relationships, when trust is violated, you may be a little bit more forgiving in your personal life because you love the person or you like the person. In a work relationship, when you violate the trust, it's really difficult to get it back, because, on some level, it's a relationship, but there's really a buffer there. I mean, the expectation is that you're not going to squeeze that buffer so much that it's like they blend into one. But the other thing I will mention, I'm sure it's not lost on anyone, is sometimes, and especially in the employer relationship, trust is earned over time, where in a lot of relationships, you just give trust freely, willingly, right? You trust them, you love them. It's like, of course I trust them. But in an employer-employee relationship, that trust a lot of times is built up over time because you've been a good employee, you've come to work, you've been dependable. When we need you for special projects, you're always available. You go above and beyond. And all of those things sort of, meld together, and, it's like, I trust this person. And if you do something which makes them not trust you, there's always that question in the back of their mind, well, if you did it this time and you felt it was okay, well, now how do I trust you as we move forward? And most of my clients, when they're in a situation like that, I mean, the answer that they usually come to, and even though it may feel bad, is that they can't trust again. So I think for employees, it's especially important that you think about those sorts of things, because once you violate the trust, I mean, is it really that unusual that you may not be able to get it back? And transparency and being communicative upfront may be better than doing something which may not feel right, but at least if you're open and honest about it, you may get an answer that's better than what you think.
This is a fascinating topic. Maybe someday we'll have another conversation for folks.
Part 2.
primary purpose of the podcast is to educate. While guests are invited to listen, listeners acknowledge that they are not being provided professional advice from the podcast or any guests. One Day, One Week and its sponsor, 17 Commerce LLC, expressly disclaim any and all liability or responsibility for any direct, indirect, incidental, special, consequential, or other damages arising out of any individual's use of, reference to, reliance on, or inability to use the podcast episodes or the information presented in the episodes.